Firstly, thanks again for inviting me to do another talk, and to the sponsors for putting this great event on. Today I'm going to talk about the early tectonic history of the Eastern Goldfields. That strong sort of north-northwest trend is made up of the north-northwest trending greenstone belts and the anastomosing shears, which has basically traditionally been thought to arise from the strong east-west compression during amalgamation of those terrains. Basically, the lake basins that you see here in orange, basically they're the same age across the Eastern Goldfields, were thought to have been deposited after the terrains have been amalgamated. But recent studies are starting to suggest that a terrain accretion model is probably not the best model to explain the Eastern Goldfields. And so today I'm going to sort of give you an alternate hypothesis. Now, most field-based structural studies recognise the strong east-west compression, or as D2. There's a few differences, but generally from D2 onwards, our structural stories are much the same. The problem arises with the deformation before that strong compression event. And this is where D1 is variably described as extensional or compressional, depending where you are in the Eastern Goldfields. And it's largely due, the differences in opinion, because of this very strong overprint by D2 and the lack of outcrop that we have in the Eastern Goldfields. Now, throughout the Eastern Goldfields, we generally have a similar sequence through all our greenstone belts. We have a basal sort of mafic, ultramafic package, overlain by an intermediate volcanosedimentary package, which of course is the black flag group here down in the Kalgoorlie area. And then that sequence is unconformably overlain by the lake basins, which you can sort of see through here. Now, there's also, in a couple of spots, Leonora and Laverton, there's actually an older sequence at 2,800 million years, and in a few other places as well, there's small remnants of this older sequence. And it's very interesting to note that in both Laverton and Leonora areas, that old sequence is paraconformably overlain by the younger sequence. So things have been quiet for a very long time in the Yilgarn. Which sort of surprised me when you start thinking about that. That's a hell of a long time. There's a 100 million year gap there. The lake basins, I think, are sort of key to our tectonic story because they're the similar age and a similar composition right across the Eastern Goldfields, and they're telling us that they've been deposited or formed in a response to a regional tectonic event. They're not just local features. The lake basins typically sort of grade from polymictic mafic conglomerates right up into siliciclastic conglomerates with a lot of granite clasts at the top. We've all seen them. And it's interesting, most of the clasts that we see are sort of well-rounded porphyry and granite sort of clasts. You don't see schist clasts and you don't see gneiss clasts, or very, very, very rare. I mean, I'm looking for them, and we work in, well, when I was with Goldfields, we have 3 lake basins in our properties. So I've been very interested in this for a while, and I've been looking for those clasts, and I just cannot find them. So they're very immature sediments. That's typically what they look like. But another interesting feature of the Eastern Goldfields is the similar metamorphic pattern that we see all over the Eastern Goldfields, where we get the sort of a bullseye pattern of lower metamorphic grades in the middle of the greenstone sequences and the higher metamorphic grades wrapping around the granite bodies. Now, this is not contact metamorphism, because those metamorphic isograds wrap around composite granite bodies, and they can be up to 100 million years difference in age within a single pluton. So the metamorphic isograds are actually showing us relative uplift. So with the deeper rocks uplifted along the edges of the granites, and the shallower levels sitting inside the middle of the basins. So it's a relative uplift feature, not contact metamorphism. So to get an idea and better understand that early deformation, we need to look at D1 structures in areas of low D2 strain, so the strain shadows for D2 deformation. And best areas are in the lee of those great big plutons. That's where things are sort of, we can still see the effects of D1 deformation. So I'm going to take you through Leonora, Agnew, and then I'll go down across to Laverton and then Kalgoorlie, and then finally we'll just have a look a little bit down here at Yardilla. Oh, and through all the maps from the different areas, it's the same colour scheme. In the green and the sort of purple is just that undivided mafic, ultramafic sequence at the bottom of the stratigraphy. The dark green and dark purple is that older 2,800 million year sequence. And then the pale brown is your black flag group sort of through the area. And the dark brown is the lake basins, just so you know for each of the maps. So I'm going to start in Leonora, and in this area the D1 fabrics are probably the best preserved that I've seen in the Eastern Goldfields. The S1 foliation through this area is the dominant fabric. That's the dark green, so that's the older sequence. And you can see it's actually overlaying there with the sequences directly on top, completely parallel. I've done lots of traverses across that contact, and there was no tilting of the older sequence. It's absolutely parallel, even though there's 100 million years age difference between those two sequences. But what we'll have a look at is the Sons of Gwalia shear zone that hosts the Gwalia, Tower Hill, Harbour Lights deposits. And it's a large shear zone. It's up to 500 metres of schistosity, of just really intense foliation, wrapping around the Rayside batholith. And we see extensional kinematics on this all the way around. And I'll just show, we'll start in Gwalia. That's what it looks like. So it's inside the Gwalia pit, very strong fabric, and up close, there's some people there for scale, we're just seeing extensional shears in that fabric. It's a very consistent pattern. If we go up the road to Tower Hill pit, there again the granite, the Rayside batholith is just sitting in the footwall there with the shear above it. It's a very strong fabric. It's a local fabric, but it's 500 metres wide. And if we go just up the road to Harbour Lights pit, the granite is sitting here in the footwall of the Harbour Lights pit, and again that's the whole sort of shear zone is that pit. And if you look on the wall there, you can see these beautiful recumbent folds. And within the shear itself, if we have a close look at the shear, beautiful extensional kinematics. Lovely recumbent folds, basically forming during tectonic sliding. And this has been well documented by multiple workers in the area. It's a well-known extensional regime. And this is where the ideas on D1 were extensional if you worked in Leonora, but if they were compressional if you're working in Kalgoorlie. This is what we're trying to tackle. If we go up to Tarmula or King of the Hills further north, it's still in the Leonora district. Again, we're seeing the S1 foliation is the dominant fabric still, even up there. There's the granite, the trondhjemite, and the S1 foliation wraps that granite, and it's parallel to bedding. So it's not an S2 foliation, it's absolutely layer parallel, and just wrapping that granite. Just south at Jasper Hills, the same fabric. There's bedding and chert beds there, but that's actually a composite fabric of S0 and S1. And on the bedding plane, beautiful, very well developed L1 stretching lineations. And you can see the upright folds are folding the S1 and the S0 fabrics. And we see that relationship all over the Eastern Goldfields with the upright north trending F2 folds folding the early fabrics. And here you can see the trace of S2 cutting across the L1 stretching lineations. So the timing of the D1 event in Leonora, basically we know that we see the S1 fabrics are really well developed both in the old sequence and in the younger 2720 to 2680. So it has to be younger than that. But as we go through the talk, we've got more constraints on the timing. But we know it's quite a young event. It's not happening back in the early Archean. It's quite young. Now we're going up to Agnew, another sort of 400 k's north of Kalgoorlie. Again, this is the Agnew granitic complex. It's a composite granite body. It can range from anything from 2680 to 2665 generally. And the D1 shears are wrapping around that granitic complex. On the eastern side, it's very shallow, dipping sort of 10 to 15 degrees out to the northeast. But along here, in the Emu shear especially, the shears are actually quite steep, 70 to 80 degrees off the western side of the granite. Again, that colour there, that's the Scotty Creek, so that's our lake basin, has been folded into tight folds through there. So I'll show you some the D1 fabrics over on the eastern side first. The very flat-lying foliations dominate, In the carapace of the granite. As soon as you go further into the granite, the fabrics disappear. So it's a local feature on the outside of the granite. And this one, in this case, there's a mafic roof pendant, so we're right at the roof of the granite, and we see the flat foliation as the dominant fabric with L1 mineral lineations in it. But if we jump across to the western side, what we see, much steeper fabrics, abundant F1 recumbent folds, and it's very ductile, and they are basically sliding, they're basically all verging gently to moderately to the west, which gives us a west side down displacement sense, which is extension. So it's actually, these layers are sliding into the Scotty Creek Basin. And basically, when we're working at Agnew, we separate these sort of folds from our upright F2 folds, mainly using the fold axial planes, because they're so different. These ones are quite shallow, and the typical F2 folds have a vertical fold axial plane. And here's another a Songvang pick, which is at the southern end of the Scotty Creek Basin. There's a large D1 shear, and it basically wraps around the Songvang granite, and then it's very shallow on the top of the granite, and it slides off and becomes quite steep on the western side. Within the shear, there are zones of, becomes an L tectonite in places, very strong stretching lineation, and a paper a couple of years ago from Thabot et al. Dated titanite, hydrothermal titanite, that's aligned parallel to that lineation that came in at 2661, which is it's a useful date. So that sort of age keeps coming up. And if we look, that's looking back at the granite contact, so it's looking south, so you can still see the shallow top of the granite, and then the contact's quite steep on that side, and the fabric rolls around. And when you look at the steepened fabric, this is what you've got. And this is what we see right through the Warunga mine and Redeemer. This is the dominant fold pattern. They're not F2 folds, they're actually slump folds, they're actually tectonic slides coming off the granite. And if we look further along the contact here, that fabric is folded by upright F2 folds. And here it is. That's just up the ramp. That's the same fabric, it's folded by the upright folds, and there's coming out of the ramp. So again, we see that same overprinting relationship with a completely different style of deformation. So the timing of D1 at Agnew, I think it's a fairly well constrained, because we know that the Emu shear with all that extensional movement is actually affecting the lake basin sediments, and the lake basin sediments are dated around 2665 to 2662, somewhere in that sort of age range. We've also got that 2661 million year age on the hydrothermal titanite within the D1 shear. So again, it's sort of giving a rough around 2660. So now we'll go across to the Laverton district. Laverton, the greenstones, this greenstone sequence is sort of sitting between two major domes, the Mount Margaret Dome and the Kalgoorlie Dome. We have a series of, again, around the domes, this is where we've got these strain shadows from D2. And the Wallaby Basin, which is one of our lake basins, is the only basin in the Eastern Goldfields that's not squashed into a tight syncline. And it's because it's protected by the Mount Margaret Dome, if you think of that. It's in a strain shadow. We have a number of large D1 shears. There's a large one at Lancefield that wraps around the southern end of the Pluton. It's got beautiful extensional kinematics in the pit there, so it's another extensional shear. We've got the Sunrise Dam shear that John Miller has mapped good extensional, early extensional movement on. And we've got Tet shear, which I'll go on to next. Again, we're seeing extension, early extension on that shear. And that's sort of an image through Tet shear. There's some of the extensional kinematics that we're seeing in the really ductile fabrics. And sort of recent work is showing that the loads are actually sitting on shears that actually work their way right back to the Tet shear. So the Tet shear is actually connected to the loads, but they've formed during extension as splays off the main Tet shear, and then with later compression we've popped those flat zones up as loads, and they're all connected. And we know that Tet shear is an early structure because that intense shear foliation, which you can still see here, that's the conglomerates, they get flattened and then they go into a myelinite. That fabric, shown in thin section here, is overprinted by peak metamorphic minerals. So we know it's an early shear, and we're seeing extension on it. So the timing of D1 events here, We've basically got, we know that the text shear offsets intrusives that are at 2662, so we know it has to be younger than that. But it also overprints the 2664 Hans Camp Syenite. So again, it's sort of pushing us in around that 2660 mark. And it's also overprinting these porphyries at Sunrise Dam. So we have a rough idea that it's basically after 2661. So it's something like that. Now we go to the Kalgoorlie district, much more strongly overprinted by the D2 deformation. It's really squashed. But even here, there's still plenty of evidence for D1. D1 structures are right through the area. We see around the plutons, we see large D1 shears wrapping around the granites like we do up north. We know we've got D1 thrust faults. We've got the Foster thrust, Tramways and Republican. We've got the Fayetteville thrust fault. We've got the large Carnelia Hill recumbent fold. So these are all D1 structures, and we know they're D1 because they're folded by the upright F2 folds, so they're early. And places like in here, the dominant fabric is actually still S1, the one that wraps around the granites. Whereas in here, of course, it's just completely overprinted by S2 and the F2 folds. Oh, the other thing I didn't point out in the other maps is the younging directions consistently away from the granites. That's consistent in all the areas. We're seeing younging away from the granites. And also, we're still seeing extension. The dominant movement sense on the Fitzroy fault from Gerard Tripp's work and Brett Davis is extensional, based on stratigraphic units being offset. Yes, there's reverse movements on it, but that is overprinting what is dominantly an extensional structure. We see pretty much in the sequence, yes, you do, at the upper black flag, you do see some local unconformities, but the main unconformities that we start seeing are at the base of the lake basins, like at the base of the Currawang, there's an unconformity. Gerard Tripp's mapped another one at the base of the Panglo. But recently also we're seeing an angular unconformity. It's only 10 or 20 degrees, but it's at the base of the Marugals between that and the black flag group. And this is at the Invincible deposit. We have unaltered Marugal formation, and it's only slightly different. In places you can see it better. Some of the times it looks parallel, but it definitely cuts down into the black flag mudstone, and it truncates the mineralisation at Invincible. And the contact typically looks like this, where it's unaltered and super strong sodic alteration in this mudstone below. And then the whole thing has been obviously folded and crumpled. So really our first angular unconformities are at the base of the lake basins. So there's minor ones in the upper black flag, but we're not seeing them earlier on in the sequences. I think it's really important for telling us about our early deformation. And also, we'll just pop up here to along the Cunnalalling shear around the Bali monzonite. And again, around the Bali dome, the fabrics are very flat, wrapping around that granite, and strong L1 stretching lineations. And in the Premier pit, beautiful extensional kinematics. That's the S1 foliation, and it's showing lovely extensional shears coming through it. So we're seeing a very similar pattern. But the timing in Kalgoorlie is not as tightly constrained. The age errors are a bit bigger, but it's still putting us in the ballpark, similar to the other areas, but we need more dating in this area. I think the overall thing that I'm seeing throughout the Eastern Goldfields is that the timing of D1 is coeval, just before, during and after the formation of the lake basins. That's the sort of key message. Now we'll just go down here to Yardilla. So it's right close to the southeastern margin of the Yilgarn, and we'll have a look at this area. Again, loads of the S1 foliation is a dominant fabric. We see lots of F1 folds. But, I mean, there's lots of areas that the S2 takes over, but there's certainly plenty of places around this patch that the S1 was the dominant fabric. And a super strong stretching lineation and quartz rodding in this area. So it's obviously some sort of large F1 fold hinge. Everything has swung around in this area just locally to a northeast trend because of the effects of the Albany-Fraser origin right beside us. And so when you see the F2 folds here, they're actually oriented northeast, but if you swing them back to their normal orientation, they match everywhere else. And you can see That's the early L1 stretching lineation, really strongly developed, and there's an upright F2 fold there. And again, you see the same thing here, refolded by the upright F2, and that's the S2 cleavage coming through. Here's some very typical upright F2 folds, and that's it's not bedding, it's a composite fabric of bedding in S1, and we've got the S2 cleavage cutting across it. And when we look in thin section, you can see the upright folds there, and that it's actually an S1 foliation. It's not just bedding, so it's actually the early fabric being folded by the upright F2 folds. So the timing here is actually quite well constrained for this deformation event, because there was a little porphyry body right in the guts of this hinge with the very strong stretching lineation. It matched perfectly with the stretched rods around, and we got that dated at 2666, which surprised me because I just assumed that D1 would be really old, but it's come back the same age as the Mount Boucher's formation, which is a lake basin sediments just here to the further to the west. So that really surprised me when we got that date back. So again, it's telling us D1 is the same timing as our lake basins. So after sort of putting the field work together, I basically started looking at all the regional maps from the survey, just the 250 sheets, and started building up structural summary maps across the Eastern Goldfields. And I've just chosen a couple of spots, the Leonora area. So I've just simplified the geology right down, just still showing the lake basin there and the older sequence there. But the fine black lines are just the foliation trajectory lines through all the S2, the S3, S2 cleavages. I've just basically grouped anything that was upright and north-northwest trending as a compressional foliation. So I've just grouped it like that. And then anything that was layer parallel and at a high angle to that as S1. And I've just done that in the red dashes. And basically the green lines there are the F1 fold hinges. You can see they're at a high angle to the dominant north-northwest trend. And again, there's those younging directions consistently away from the granites. So Leonora is actually, this is pretty protected. It's not very strongly deformed by the east-west compression. It's in a strain shadow. That's the perfect place we need to see the D1 event. Go to Kalgoorlie, as you can see, much more strongly overprinted by the S2 cleavage. You can see the features like the synclinal keels of Marugal Formation and the Currawang, great big syncline coming through there. But, you know, there's still plenty of areas where S1 is still easily visible, particularly in these little quiet zones in the strain shadows. So there's still patches you can see. And yes, we've seen that we can see the D1 thrusts down here. So D1 is still visible. But again, younging directions away from the granites. So I think one of the main things to remember is the D1 event is coeval with the lake basins. So if the lake basins have got granite clasts in them, we need a mechanism that rapidly uplifts and exhumes the granites so that it can supply the clasts into these basins. And previous models have suggested compression, that uplift and dome formation developed prior to deposition of these lake basins during the amalgamation of the terrains. But what we see is that the older sequence, that 2800 million year sequence, is paraconformably overlain by the younger sequence. Things are really quiet. It doesn't look like an orogeny. And also, we don't see any schist clasts or gneiss clasts in the lake basins. They're very undeformed rocks, very juvenile. So we need an alternative mechanism. And there's some features, I think, in the goldfields that are key to the story. And the fact is that we see these major shears that wrap around the granites. They're showing good extensional kinematics where we can map them out. The D1 shears are typically at least 10 million years younger than the actual granites that are in place there. So it's telling us they are solid state fabrics. They're not related to the emplacement of the granites. And I think they're related to the movement around the granite during this tectonic event. The greenstone sequences consistently face away from the granites, and the youngest rocks are typically near the centre of the basins. And we see also that similar pattern of metamorphic facies throughout the Eastern Goldfields, with the highest metamorphic grades around the granites and the lowest metamorphic grades in the centre of the greenstone belts. So I think all of these features, we put them together, suggest that a model of density inversion or collapse of thickened crust, in other words, granite up greenstone-down tectonics best explains the features that we see in the Eastern Goldfields. And what would that look like as a model? Basically, you'd start, basically, if you think of it, we've loaded a felsic crust with 30, 40 million years worth of mafic and ultramafic material. It's sitting on a felsic crust, so it's much denser. It wants to head down, and the granites are coming up. When that happens, what we see is extensional shears and large recumbent folds pretty much sort of verging down into the basin. But if you imagine the granites coming up and the greenstone sinking, there's a space problem. Basically, the greenstones are basically trying to fit into a smaller and smaller space as the granites are rising. And this is where we start developing thrust faults in the centre of the downgoing greenstone belts. Things like the Foster thrust and things like that are actually compressional features forming during this event. As those greenstones continue to subside, the area of the greenstone belts that are sinking the most become the basin. That becomes the depot centre for your lake basins. And this is where we basically get the angular unconformity at the base of the lake basin because the sequence has already been tilted and is starting to fold, so we can get quite good angular unconformities. Then finally, a D2 event comes along and crushes the entire sequence. And what we're left with is the preserved keels of the lake basins, and that's all we're seeing at Marugals and Currawang. It's on the same syncline, and there's the angular unconformity. Everything's still there, but it's just now absolutely tightly folded. So if we think about this in the Kalgoorlie area, you've basically got a cross-section through here. Your granites are coming up, your greenstones are going down, you're starting to form those big D1 shears, and then over time, we're still subsiding. We basically, I think we're having a proximal zone around Kalgoorlie and Kambalda, where we've got the Marugals and the Currawangs, Panglo Basin, Penny Dam conglomerate is all proximal. By the time we get out to Mount Boucher's Formation, it's all sands and mudstones. So I'm seeing, and they're the same age, so we're seeing a proximal and a distal sedimentation going on. So it's obviously outflow out this way. And then we fold everything and we're left with this pattern. So basically, there's the keel of the syncline that's preserved, there's the keel of that syncline. We have the Panglo Basin preserved there, but basically you have a sequence that's going up and down just with the folding. So that's why we see the ultramafics coming up and down across there. And you get these little remnant patches of lake basin conglomerate all the way through areas. And I know we've all been mapping out there and seen these little patches, and they're just little patches left behind. So in conclusion, I think a gravity inversion model or the granite-up, greenstone-down tectonics allows uplift of granite domes with only local deformation of the overlying greenstone sequences, and it preserves those younging directions away from the granite. And then so the subsequent D2 and 3 deformation is just modifying an established dome and basin geometry, and the D1 fabrics are preserved in those D2 strain shadows. So overall, that timing of the D1 is a lot younger than I ever thought it would be. It's the same time as the lake basins are forming. Before that, we see little evidence of significant deformation. But at 2650, that's where pretty much the compression roughly then is starting to come in, that D2 event. It's interesting because at that time, that's the end of our sedimentary record, which is the lake basins, but it's also where we see that big shift from high calcium to low calcium granites. And I think that is telling us, those two features are telling us we're seeing a major change in our tectonic regime. And I think we're going from a dominantly extensional regime to compression, and it stays compressional until our last orogenic collapse. So basically, it's a major change in tectonic regime, and I think this model suggests that the Eastern Goldfields can't form by accretionary tectonics. It's completely different. Thank you.